We are learning more tonight about those tense moments that could have escalated tensions with Iran even further, with the president toggling between fiery rhetoric and the language of restraint. This morning, President Trump tweeted that the United States had last night been cocked and loaded for a strike against 3 targets in Iran. This in retaliation for Iran's downing of a U.S. drone, but that he called it off just 10 minutes before the scheduled attack after being told that 150 Iranians would be killed. In an exclusive interview with NBC's Chuck Todd, the president discussed his decision to call off the strike. Let's watch.
Were planes in the air?
We're about ready to go.
Yeah?
No, but they would have been pretty soon. And things would have happened to a point where you wouldn't turn back or couldn't turn back. So they came and they said, sir, we're ready to go. We'd like a decision. I said, I want to know something before you go. How many people will be killed? In this case, Iranians. Mm-hmm. I said, how many people are going to be killed? Sir, I'd like to get back to you on that. Great people, these generals. They said, came back, said, sir, approximately 150. And I thought about it for a second. I said, you know what? They shot down an unmanned drone, plane, whatever you want to call it. And here we are sitting with 150 dead people. That would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said go ahead.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it. I didn't think it was proportionate.
Now, it's not clear why the president would receive details about the potential casualties with just 10 minutes to spare. According to the New York Times, the president's advisors were split, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and CIA Director Gina Haspel in favor of the attack, while Pentagon officials, quote, cautioned that such an action could result in a spiraling escalation with risks for American forces in the region. The New York Times also reported that the president was pleased with his decision to pull back because he liked the command of approving the strike, but also the decisiveness of calling it off. Some of his conservative allies were not as pleased.
So at some point in the Middle East, no action looks like weakness, and weakness begets more attacks.
The failure to respond to this kind of direct provocation that we've seen now from the Iranians, in particular over the last several weeks, could in fact be a very serious mistake.
And for more, I'm joined by Jonathan Lemire, Associated Press White House reporter, Hagar Shamali, former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN, Bret Stephens, New York Times op-ed columnist, and Robert Malley, senior advisor to the White House for Iran deal negotiations. John, let me just start with you. The idea that the president's concern on this, in the end, was the casualty count, and he finds out that number 10 minutes before calling this thing off. Does that make sense that he would only be hearing about that number then?
No, that defies credibility. And in fact, we, in our reporting, he was given hours earlier when presented with a number of options. He was given like a rough estimate as to what the casualty count could be. But it's also not unexpected. It's not unprecedented for any president, not just this one, to right before giving the order sort of ask again to kind of double check to see if the situation had changed in the ground. And at that moment he was told at about 150, and that was enough to give him pause. This is a moment where, for a president who has very little in the way of fixed ideology, this is something that he's been fairly consistent on. He just is very reluctant to use military force. Since he's taken office, he's got a couple of airstrikes in Syria. That's been about the extent of it. He was leery. He's been, in recent weeks, has felt pushed a little bit into this conflict by National Security Advisor Bolton in particular, to the point where, according to our reporting, he's tuning him out a little bit. He's tired of being sort of pushed into a corner by Bolton on Iran. He did indeed, as the Times first reported, sort of like this idea of being decisive and sort of making the decision, but then feeling like he made the right call to pull back. He doesn't want to escalate tensions further, at least for now. Although, let's be clear, they didn't order the strike last night. It's not taken off the table. There's something like this certainly could happen in the days or weeks ahead if tensions with Iran continue to rise.
Yeah, and Bret, what does this tell you about the voices around the president, the influencers around the president? You talk about Bolton, for instance, being an advocate, other folks cautioning him. Do you read this as the triumph of one group over another in terms of sort of getting to him with their perspective on this, or is this more what John's alluding to here, this longer-standing hesitation of the president maybe to be sucked into some sort of confrontation overseas?
I think what you're seeing is an indecisive president who likes to speak loudly and carry a small stick. Look, the president had 2 perfectly credible options before him. One of them would have been a short punitive strike to take out the kind of the SAM batteries, the missile batteries that took out our planes, and a clear signal to the Iranians: we are not going to tolerate having our assets knocked out from the skies over international waters. That's unacceptable. Other option, also equally credible, is do nothing. We're continue to apply economic sanctions. We're not going to be lured into a cycle of confrontation that the Iranians may want. What he's now essentially done is advertise to the Iranians that he's a Twitter tiger, that he likes to make loud threats, but that he's not going to carry through on them. So it's an invitation to an Iranian leadership that is a very good student of the weakness of its enemies, how far they can push. And I think they're going to continue to push farther.
Does that sound right to you, Hagar? Do you think the leaders in Iran that that's how they interpret this? And if so, what does that mean in terms of what they do now?
Well, it's absolutely. Brett and I were talking about this earlier, actually, that in face of an adversary like Iran, they're listening very carefully, and they understand, most importantly, the language of force. And that's the case, by the way, for a lot of the leaders in the region. So he ended up, President Trump, with the worst of both worlds, because if he had just responded with sanctions, it may have been too weak. If he had issued an airstrike, it's risky business, right? I mean, Iran has a strong presence across the region. They fund armed, trained militias and terrorist organizations in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, next to where we have U.S. assets, U.S. troops. I mean, it's a very risky business. Where we ended up was the worst of both worlds. So now we've ended in this situation where everyone is wondering the next steps. The United States has called for a Security Council meeting on Monday, which probably means they're calling for greater attention to the issue. Maybe they'll try and follow up with a resolution. But my guess right now is that they're trying to rally the troops.
Yeah, but if Iran, we always use the term, is Iran emboldened in a situation like this? If they are, what would that mean? What would that look like to us?
It's both. Listen, they may be emboldened on the fact that they're thinking that President Trump is bluffing, that if he ever says again, oh, I'm going to use military force, they may not believe it. On the other hand, the economic sanctions are really having a significant effect, even without Europe on board. And that's because no international business wants to get in the crosshairs of U.S. sanctions. And so that will likely bring Iran to its knees again. It feels like 2011 all over again.
All right. Well, Robert, you were quoted in the New York Times saying, quote, in some ways, President Trump is on a collision course with himself. He says he's in favor of maximum pressure and he's against military confrontation when it comes to Iran. But both of those things can't be true because one of those things can lead to the other. So what should he do now?
Well, first, I mean, I think we're missing a bit the broader context here. What happened yesterday was just the result of the policies that the Trump administration has been pursuing since he's been in office, which is this policy of maximum pressure, violating the Iran nuclear deal, trying to bring Iran to its knees. That has succeeded to bring Iran to its knees, but has not succeeded in the goals that the administration has said it was pursuing, which is to get a better nuclear deal and to restrain Iran's policies. In fact, it's produced the exact opposite. And when I say that President Trump is on a collision course with himself, it's because I'm convinced he doesn't want a war, but the policies he's been pursuing are leading there because Iran will react if it's under pressure, and it's reacting exactly in the way that people had predicted, by upping the pressure in the region and by taking steps now to walk away from the nuclear deal. What's needed is a change of course meaning getting back to diplomacy and offering Iran a realistic way out, as opposed to what has been taking place so far, which is pressure, telling them to surrender, and when they react, then President Trump is confronted with this difficult dilemma. Does he strike, which goes against his instincts, or does he take a step back, which obviously some people are upset about, but which in the end I would say was the better of the two decisions.
So, but just given, I know you helped put the Iran deal together, you don't think the administration has made a good decision there. We are where we are. When you have this down drone, you're saying it's better not to do the attack. What should, short of getting back in the Iran deal, which it seems like this administration is not inclined to do, again, whether you like that or not, what should the course be then?
Well, so you're right. I mean, we are where we are. We shouldn't be here, and we're here in time. This is a completely manufactured crisis because of the Trump administration's policies. But if we are where we are now, what needs to be done is a diplomatic track where the administration says we're prepared to talk to Iran, but not on the basis of the 12 demands that Secretary Pompeo made, which basically amount to capitulation, but a fair negotiation or fair diplomatic engagement where the U.S. is prepared to step back some of its pressure, and Iran would have to take some reciprocal steps of its own. I'm not sure I expect that from the administration either, but it would be a far wiser course than upping the ante, putting more sanctions, pressuring Iran more, and then when Iran reacts, being faced with the kind of dilemma that President Trump was faced with last night.
John, do you have any sense that folks in the administration, how they are processing this? Was this did this catch people flat-footed? What a response from from folks who are advocating for it potentially? Were they surprised, and how are they handling it today? How are they reacting to it?
I mean, I think they were speaking at least to reporters publicly with one voice, saying that they presented the options to the president, they support his decision. But there was a split in the administration, and as outlined before, it was Bolton was certainly the strongest voice for the attack. Pompeo was advocating it too, but a little more circumspect. Vice President Pence sort of suggested he would go along with whatever President Trump wanted. And the Department of Defense officials had said cautionary what could happen next. I think it will be interesting to see what happens now in terms of particularly Bolton's influence. As I was saying earlier, it is not just about Iran. It was previously Venezuela as well, where the president has felt like Bolton has steered him some bad advice. And I think there is some frustration growing on Bolton's team that he's not being listened to. And I think the president is sort of tired of some of Bolton's advocacy for more the military options. And in fact, as we've reported this week, Trump, he didn't just limit his circle of calls looking for advice from Bolton and Pompeo and Pence. He spoke to Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host, who's been very much against sort of waging any sort of strike with Iran.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.